I'm Heather Lindon. I was working in the IPNI team from about 2013 until spring of this year, and I'm currently working now at the National Archives across the street. But I'm, as you said, an honorary research associate, so I'm working with that, continuing some of the work that I'm going to talk about today. And we haven't actually presented this work before, I don't think, to Kew Science. We were talking about this, and I was invited to talk in Colombia. Bat has spoken at the Linnean Society. We've had posters, but I don't think we ever actually gave a talk about this to Kew Science. So I'm very excited to share with you guys what we've been working on for the past several years, past 15, no, not 15, starting in 2015, 2014. And there have been quite a few of you that contributed. So Bat and I, Lauren Gardner, who used to work at Kew, Abigail Brady, who is a friend of Bat's, and a student of mine, Rahid Dina, did some of the work that I'll show you later. So I wanted to take the context outside of botany for a little bit and just talk about using old data for new purposes. So this is an example of a voter registration from the National Archives that was from 1957. And my partner's father, we knew he lived in England sometime in the 50s, but we didn't know when he came, we didn't know where he lived, we didn't really know anything about it. And so this information was collected in order to know who was eligible to vote in Haringey in the 1950s, but it's being used now for a completely different purpose on Ancestry.com for people like us to look up people who are no longer with us to find out information about their past. So what we managed to find out was that he was living there in the 50s, that he lived with his sister and brother. We could look up the house on Google Maps where he lived. So this purpose of collecting the information for voting now, 70 years later, is being used for a completely different purpose. And that's kind of what we were going to do with the work that I'm going to present. And the other part of this work was looking at women in science and trying to find women in these records. But it's really difficult to find people in the past by characteristics that were not necessarily recorded. So at the archives, the National Archives, they've been trying to work more with uncovering stories of LGBT people in the past, or uncovering Black people in history. And this is an example from the Tudor period, where there were people descended from Africans, either coming via Spain or via Portugal, that were in the records, but they're very difficult to find because they weren't necessarily recorded. People didn't think it was important enough, or it wasn't part of the information that was recorded. And we know about this guy, John Blanc, who was a trumpet player in the court of Henry VIII. And we know about him because the records of him being paid, the records of him getting married, and the gifts that were given to him for his marriage were recorded. But it's really difficult to know anything else about him because you wouldn't necessarily record other personal information on a pay slip. But there's this existing image of him from this Westminster tournament roll that clearly shows that he had some kind of African ancestry, and he is sometimes listed as John Blanc, Blackamoor, or other terms that were used at the time. So you can find people in the past from other characteristics, but it can be kind of difficult. And so the herbarium and Kew in general, they have a lot of information, a lot of records that were collected for one purpose. So plant specimens were collected to have a record of what was growing there. And there's some incidental information recorded about when it was collected, where, who collected it. But that information wasn't necessarily the primary reason. So you might not know some other information that would be interesting for researchers later, 50 years, 100 years later, to look at. And now that things are starting to get digitized and this is available on online databases, we're starting to be able to ask and answer questions with this information that it was not originally intended for. So this is the part that I know the most about. This is an image of the published paper copies of Index Kewensis. This was a list of all plant names published that was instigated by Charles Darwin in the 1880s, and it was published through Kew. There were 4 original volumes, and then there was a supplemental volume published every 5 years up until the year 2000. And at that point, the Index Kewensis database plus Harvard's name database and an Australian database were all joined up together into an online searchable database. So that's the image on the right here, International Plant Names Index, or IPNI. And the website is not so new anymore, although in the context of the history of this from 1882, it's still quite new. But you have the list of names, which originally, when you had the paper copy, pretty much the only thing you could do with it was look up a plant name by genus. You couldn't look up plant names by an author. You couldn't look up plant names by a specific year. You couldn't look up names by a publication. You could only use the index to look up a plant name. And now, of course, that it's in a database, that there's no limit to the ways that we can slice and dice the data and the things that we can look at and things that we can find out. So that's kind of where we started with this work. And for those who aren't familiar with how plant names appear or how they get published, this is a publication from Kew Bulletin in 2017. And this is a new grass species that named and described from Madagascar. And in the red circle, this is what we call the prologue, and it records the name of the plant. It records the person who named it. So in this case, this is that, and she's using a standard author form. So in this case, it's an abbreviated form of her last name. And then it gives some other information about where it was collected, what the specimens are, where they're located, and it has an IPNI ID. And this is great for plant names because it records the relevant information for the plant name, the person who named it, and the type information. But it doesn't really give us that much information about who named the plant. You can see this is how the digital record will appear on IPNI. So all that information from that prologue is taken out. It's parsed into different fields. So we have a field for the year. So you could quickly look up plants named in 2017. You could look up genus. You can look up the species. And you can see that this unique plant namer, whose standard form is Voron, is associated with its name. And this is the same for having the ORCID IDs for people who publish journals and books and that kind of thing. It's a way to uniquely identify someone, but it doesn't tell you that much about the person. But IPNI has another portion of the database, which is just a list of people who publish plant and fungal names, and also fossils, algae. There's quite a few groups covered. And you can see there is more information here. You can see the names expanded out. So Maria Vorontsova. If you're familiar with Russian names, you would recognize that this is a name of a woman, first name Maria, name of a woman. So you could tell a little bit more about the person, but still not as much as maybe you might be interested in later if you were doing social research. So we thought, well, we have this database of author names, and we have a database of plant names, and we can definitely do something with this. There are ways that we can put labels on it, and we can ask more questions, and we can get some answers with them. But some of you might be having the reaction to this that I had when I saw this restoration in a church in Spain. You might be thinking, but why though? I mean, sure, you can make a database of people's names and you can assign gender to them, but who cares? It's not science and it's not botany, and this is kind of a waste of time. Or maybe people think it's sexist to try to figure out, you know, who named a plant. If it's a man or a woman, they think, well, who cares? This should be gender neutral. We shouldn't be trying to look at people that way. You know, we're just scientists. We don't want to have all of this other stuff thrown on, or it happened in the past. We can't undo the past. We know that there was gender inequality in the past, and those are all good questions. But I would say we were just curious, first of all, just to see. We didn't know how many men or women, you know, it could have been 50-50, or there could be more women now. The short answer is you have no idea until you actually look at the information, what you're going to find. So just curious, we wanted to know what the outcome would be. And there's also this issue of being a role model. We were reminiscing about the origins of how we even got started down this path. And I think Bill Baker had shown Lauren Gardner an article about women who were invited to speak at conferences, typically then got invited to speak at conferences, or men who got invited tend to get invited. But the point is, there was kind of a cycle where only people who were invited to speak were then invited to speak at other conferences. So we wanted to be able to show role models of women who maybe weren't obvious. People don't necessarily know about them because they're hidden in this data, they're hidden in these author standard forms that don't really tell us that much about the person who's doing the naming. So just to uncover role models would have been enough for me, and we didn't really need to worry about anything else about inequality in the beginning. Also, I'm going to point out, I'm throwing the term gender around in this talk very loosely. We just wanted to assign gender based on a person's first name, and we weren't going to go into any of the other complications with gender. So it's just a very loose use of the term, just because it would get too complicated too quickly otherwise. So this is what we came up with in the end after a first pass. This is some work that Abigail did. Abigail Brady used the Wikipedia list of names, first names for people. And so we had first names of authors, we had last names, and we did a quick pass with Wikipedia to try to get the genders first where we could. So any names that were listed as belonging to men, then we assigned an M. Names that we couldn't definitively assign, so for example, this Andrea, which is on the fourth line here, could potentially be a man's name, could potentially be a woman's name. It depends on the culture. Other names like Chinese names, we spoke a lot to Chinese researchers who said there isn't really a reliable way to know if you look at a person's name if they're a man or a woman. So those we had to just put as U for unknown. And then for any women that we did uncover, because there was a relatively few number of them, we went through them by hand and just double checked. The French name Jean did give us a bit of trouble because that came up as the American name or the English name Jean. So we had to correct some of those. So this is a very carefully curated set of about 50,000 plant and fungal and algal name authors, and the gender that we thought was closest to what we could tell from their first name. And this is a freely available data set. I've put it on Zenodo. There's already been an update. And I've also updated Wikidata. It has a lot of people labeled as botanists, and they have their IPNI standard forms on there. So I was able to match up and do corrections. So it's a very lovingly curated data set. Always happy to get feedback on it as well if your name's on there and you'd like it to be updated. But this was the initial set of information that we came up with that we could reliably now match the standard form of a plant name author and the gender of the person who named the plant or fungus. And the result of that was a paper in 2015. It was published in Taxon, and it just had this overarching headline that about 3% of land plants were named by women. And it was a look over the past 260 years of plant names to see what the results were. And when we look at just that list of about 50,000 authors, we could see about 12% of the people on that list were women, about 62% were men, and about a quarter of them we weren't able to distinguish either way. So, I mean, that's pretty good. Over 10% women on the list, considering the list stretches back into the 1700s. If you look at the plant names, that's a little bit smaller for women, about 3% of all of the new names that were in the list. So we weren't at this point counting any names that had moved from one genus or another. This was strictly just things that were considered new by the authors. So 3% of those had been named by women, 4% by people whose gender we couldn't determine, and then 93% of them by men. So now we had a statistic we could kind of talk about this and throw these numbers around. And we also wanted to look at this over time because it's not necessarily useful to look into the far past, because we know, for example, the earliest names that we have from 1753, these were the ones published by Linnaeus, and the Linnaean system is the one that we're using now. There were plant names before that, but that's not in the system that we're considering. So he started it off and had the most names in the beginning, but you can see as time goes on, the blue boxes here in the bottom, those represent the contribution of female authors. So around the turn of the last century is when we start to see women creeping up in bigger numbers, increasing fairly steadily. Kind of pre-war years, it was a bit higher, and then there was another bit of a dip, and then it's been increasing recently. So we're at around 10 or 11% of the plants that are currently being named are named by women. So now we have that information, And we can start to think of more questions to ask about it, or start to ask why that might be the case. And another result was that we were able to get a bit of a timeline for women. We know a lot of the history for men. We know about 1753 when Linnaeus published. We know some other prolific male plant namers, but here we were able to identify some early women, for example, this Mary, Duchess of Beaufort, who contributed specimens to what later became the Natural History Museum. We were able to pick out the first woman to name a plant in the system, and the few women that followed in the 18th century, and also more recently to pick out prolific women, who was the most prolific and who are still currently working and naming plants. So I just wanted to pick out and highlight a few superlative ladies. So for me, Elizabeth Blackwell, she's one of the most interesting people that we uncovered definitively, because if somebody had asked me in 2014 who was the first woman to name a plant in the Linnaean system, there wasn't an easy way to find out using the plant names database. But now I can tell you it was Elizabeth Blackwell. She has a wonderful story that involves eloping with her cousin from Scotland, him practicing medicine without a license, being imprisoned. She turned to botany as a way to get him out of debt. Strange but true. And then her husband worked in the Swedish court and was murdered under some intrigue. So there's a lot going on here. But she was able to work at the Chelsea Physic Garden, and she lived across the street, and she was doing illustration of plants. So I've actually written into English Heritage to suggest that there could be a blue plaque at the building where she had lived and worked, because there isn't now currently one. That's another casualty of COVID. I have a friend who works in the English Heritage, and she said, oh, they're so backlogged for the blue plaques, they haven't been able to get the application through, but I'm hoping it will go through eventually. So Elizabeth Blackwell, earliest woman to name a plant in the Linnaean system. And two other superlative ladies that we were able to pull out of the data are Louisa Bolus. She's the most prolific female author. And when I say prolific, and we're talking about the numbers of plants, we assigned, if two people authored a plant, we gave them each 50% credit. So this isn't the number of plants necessarily they've named, but this is how much effort we've assigned to them. So Louisa Bolus is the most prolific. And then there's Dr. Charlotte Taylor. She is actually still working in botany. She works at the Missouri Botanic Gardens, and she works on Rubiaceae. And so she is, I think she's number 5 or number 6 at the moment in the top 10. And we've spoken to her quite a bit about this work. And she says in this photo here behind her is a whole bunch of unknown, undescribed Rubiaceae. So it's possible within her career, within her lifetime, that she might move up the leaderboard and maybe even overtake Louisa Bolus, who knows. So it was really exciting to have somebody whose life and whose research was impacted by our work, and that we've been able to correspond with about this. And we'll hear more about her later, because she comes up quite a few times in the data. So we had done this work in 2015, got this published. We thought it was really interesting, and it was great for us to be able to talk to other people, particularly women. There wasn't a gender Kew group at the time or anything, but this was just kind of around in the atmosphere. And then Bat was invited to speak. The Linnaean Society had a celebration of 100 years of women being allowed in the Linnaean Society. So we took the opportunity to revisit this work and try to see what other questions could potentially answer with this data set that we had. So we came up with this idea of looking at a taxonomic effort across kingdoms. The first work was just looking purely at new plants that were being named. And now we wanted to look more at combinations that we thought might reflect more the effort of reorganizing the plant science knowledge rather than just trying to describe things that were new. And we also had the opportunity to work with the Index Fungorum dataset, which is held at Kew, that Paul Kirk works on, and try to see, is there a difference between people who do mycology and people who do plant science? Is it about the same? Is it different? Is there anything we can learn from this? So this work was meant to be published in a special issue of the Linnaeans Journal. Again, another casualty of COVID. I don't think it was supposed to come out this year. We haven't heard anything, but that has put it on ResearchGate as a preprint if you're interested in looking at the results of this. So there's a DOI down here. But this was the second bit of work, and we came up with some more graphs quite similar to the first ones we found. This is information from plants, and we only were looking at the recent past because we wanted to uncover more recent role models, and we thought if we looked at the whole set of data, that wasn't necessarily going to be relevant because there were so few women in the early days. So looking at the 1930s onward allowed us to find more women, and also the data were more reliable from that time period. And you can see on the left, these are just new names that were published. So mostly done by men, a few women creeping in at the 2 and so on percent level, and not 2, sorry, 6%, all the way up to just over 12% in the last decade. And if you compare that to women who publish new combinations, the percentage of women who contribute is at about 13%. So it's not so different, those who name new plant species and those who do new combinations. So it seems like the representation is about the same in these two areas of science. Taking it over into fungi, situation is fairly similar, maybe slightly lower. So in the past decade or two, this ranged from about 9 to 11% women naming new fungi. And for new combinations, it's about the same, between say 10 and 11% of the new fungal combinations have been done by women. So I'm not sure really what conclusions you could draw that they're the same, but it's interesting to know. And now that you have the numbers, you can see it has been increasing. You can see the speed at which it's been increasing, but you can also, if you think back to that first figure I showed you about the percentage of women that are working, it was about 12% in the whole database, and this is close to 12%. So maybe that's not a bad reflection of how much women are contributing. And the other thing we uncovered in this paper then were the women who were still working, still alive, who were in the top 10 leaderboards for these groups. So we found these superlative women, and we asked them to contribute to that publication, to just write in their own words a little bit about their research, a little bit about their career, just as kind of a role model and something for anybody who's interested in being a botanist or the lives of botanists, what it's like for them. So we have Mary Barkworth. She had produced 151 grass combinations. She was on the leaderboard for new combinations. There's Susan Carter. She's actually a former Kew staff member. She worked on the flora tropical East Africa, and she had 149 new plant names. These were mostly in succulents. Cheryl in mycology, I won't try to pronounce her last name, but she produced 142 new names at the time that we compiled the list. This would have been in 2018. Ruth, working in Malaysia primarily, she had 166 new names. Lucia Lohman was one of the highest ones for combinations, 187 in the tropics. And then Barbara Paris, I think anybody who works on ferns will probably recognize her name. She's got 370 fern combinations. And I think shortly after I had done the analysis for this paper, she had published several more. So she's still quite active in getting fern names out. Another mycologist, Amy Rossman, she had 211 combinations, and she also had a new fungus named after her, which was quite nice to put in as a footnote. And Ruth also had a genus named after her, I believe. So it's nice to see these women getting honored in plant names. Barbara Rise, an Australian botanist, she had 157 new names. And then again, Charlotte Taylor showed up. She showed up on the top 10s for both new species, where she contributed to 409, and to new combinations as well for 262. So that was really interesting to correspond with all these women and to ask them to contribute their stories and just get a sense of different generations of women working across botany. So we have this data set, we have 2 papers, and we just keep getting more questions. We know who did what and when, we know who published and when they did it, but there's a lot about how people publish names and what influence do other people and other role models have on getting plant names published and doing taxonomy. And I had a student, Rahim Dina, he was working in the IPNI team in 2018, and I asked him to just start teasing apart some information to see if we could get any answers. So we thought, well, maybe we can look to see people that publish alone versus people that publish in groups. So this was a visual he did of that, which is a little bit of a hot mess, I suppose. I mean, it's very difficult to draw any conclusions from this. So there's definitely some scope for us to dig into this data and see that do women publish more when they're with another person or when they publish by themselves, vice versa. More to be done there. And the same thread about publishing in groups, we thought, well, let's look at people who are very prolific publishers and their networks of publishing and see if we can find anything there. So Charlotte Taylor appears as the center of a cluster here, working with several other people, a lot of them women. So we've got Daniela Zappi here, some other well-known authors, but most of these clusters do tend to center around male authors working with other male authors. And then we have another cluster here of orchid names. So there's definitely a lot to be unpacked here, but we start to get outside of the scope of nomenclature and taxonomy where I'm most comfortable. And it would be really great to work with people who work with network graphs or, you know, more computer programming to try to tease apart some of the information that we have here. And I just did a quick rundown of all of the groups of authors. So this is the MM in the center, the large one, that represents male authors who published with one other male author. That made up the largest group of people who published in groups, followed by men who published with women as a second author. So for those of you not familiar with the nomenclature, the order that you publish in, the order that the names appear does have significance. So being first author or being second or last, that has some significance about the person's role in plant naming. So this does show that men and a pair of a man and a woman makes up a large number of names. Also with women publishing first, you can see on the left, women publishing with men as a second author. The largest string we had of all women was 3 women publishing together. And I think there's quite a few strings of unknown authors. And there's on the bottom left here, a string of 5 male authors together. So again, I can make a visual representation and get an overall feeling for what these pairs and these groups look like, but teasing apart this information into answering a meaningful question is a lot more difficult. So we'll be trying to do that. We also tried to look at taxonomists and people who collect plants, because we thought, oh great, we have HerbCat, we have information about who's collecting plants. Let's see if we can apply what we have. It turns out the HerbCat data is very messy. I know Nikki Nicholson has been working on this problem of identifying plant collectors to themselves in the data, but we just thought, let's look at it and see what we can come up with. So we had a look at the taxonomists and the species in the beginning from the paper in 2015, and then looking at taxonomists who collect, it looked like it was about the same breakdown of about 10 to 12% women. And of the collections that we were able to assign definitively the collector and that we knew the collector gender, it came out again about 12%. So slightly more than there were for just the naming, but the timeline is probably more biased towards the recent past just because of the collection of herbarium specimens. And this is a rough graph here of the plant collector data over time. The top one is the one I showed at the beginning about people who name plants, and you can see it was about 12% women in the most recent decades. For the collectors, it goes as high as 25% and then drops down to about 10 or 15 or 12. I'm very suspicious of this when it looks so high. It could be just an artifact of a lot of collections of one person that we happen to have in the system, but it still gives some information that's generally consistent, that it's going up over time, that there's about, I don't know, between 10 and 15% women. So more information, and as always, more questions and more things we'd like to do with the data. So I'll just leave you with this XKCD cartoon about trying to solve all these problems and answer these questions with algorithms. The more that we do it, the more complicated that we realize it is, and the more questions we have about it. But I still think it's really interesting and worthwhile research, and it's some of the stuff that I've had the most fun interacting with people about and talking about and just generating ideas and getting more more excited about doing this kind of work. So I was very glad to have the opportunity to share this work with Kew Science, and would be very happy to answer any questions.